Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. Today, we're going to be doing a discussion on the resurrection because we are celebrating that just in a few hours as we continue through Holy Week. All that we have built up to this point in Lent is now coming to its full consummation. Good Friday, today being Holy Saturday, as we enter into the moments of thought into the glorious resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so I figured what I would do for a special episode is focus on the resurrection. And one of the ways I want to do this is actually pull up for us all four accounts of the Gospels, look at them side by side. Where are they in agreement? Where are they unique? Where are they differing? Or at least it appears that they're differing at times. I want to pull them up on the screen and I want to do a discussion on that. I think it'll be a very helpful thing for us to do as we celebrate this time of year and see that the accounts of the Gospels are simply reliable from eyewitness standpoints and that they're not just copying each other. And that's the weird thing about the Gospels that I've complained about for years is that the critics will come to the Gospels and they'll go, wait, they're just borrowing from each other. There's nothing unique about them. And then when they do something unique, it's like, well, those are interpolations. That was made up later. That wasn't in the original accounts. So there's no winning with those people. There's no reasoning and there's no logic that'll follow that'll work anyway in the favor of Christianity in the four Gospels. So we're not worried about them today. We're just going to simply put up the data and look at it and see what things are unique and what things are different. In our first section here, we have the Gospel of Matthew in the first column. And again, as always, those that are watching this at home, you can see it. Those that are listening to it on the podcast, my apologies as always, but we try to always read very carefully for you what we've got going on so that you can follow along as best as possible. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 1 through 9, we see the entry of the timing. And so we have after the Sabbath, the first day of the week, the dawn began, right? So Mark does kind of the same thing. Now, when the Sabbath was passed, and Luke does something similar on the first day of the week, very early in the morning. So we're all on Sunday here. John does the same thing. First day of the week, and he explicitly says that Mary Magdalene came to the tomb while it was still dark. So right at the beginning, like there's no doubt in our minds as to when Jesus resurrected. The tomb was found empty somewhere right before sunrise. Now remember, in Jewish days, Sunday would have began sundown on Saturday. We start a new day at midnight. They started the day after the sun went down. New day starts up till the next day when the sun goes down, then again, repeat. So Jesus apparently resurrected, according to all four accounts, somewhere between sundown and sunrise. That could have been moments before the women got there. That could have been at midnight. That could have been at 2 a.m. That could have been at 5 a.m. We don't know. And it should be noted that the accounts here are not so specific that we miss it. That the accounts here are not so specific as if they're trying to sell you something. Because they're not willing to give up what little they did receive and see and hear and know and make sure that that was reported and leave it alone. The Gospel of Peter, for example, which I have my own translation of, when you read the Gospel of Peter, it's extravagant. I mean, it's painting this thing up. The moment by moment, play by play, Jesus coming out of the tomb, leaned up on two angels that came down from heaven, coming out of the tomb, rising above the horizon. And there's the cross and behind him, and the cross starts saying a word. I mean, the Gospel of Peter is selling the event. We come to our alleged Gospels here, and their statements about this, and it's not that pretty. It's not even exciting in some senses. It's like everybody's depressed. Women are coming to bring spices because they had to rush Jesus into a burial before the high Sabbaths and then the Sabbath day itself. And so they couldn't touch a dead body. So now that the time has come where they can touch a dead body, they're now going to the tomb and going to anoint the body, which was custom of the women to do. They get there. Stone is rolled away. Everybody's confused. Random people are talking from in the tomb, out the tomb. And that's where we get into our narrative today. Now, let's look at the different women that are involved here. Matthew only specifically mentions two, and one of them is almost ambiguous. He mentions Mary Magdalene, which is consistent in all four Gospels. She is the main consistent figure that all four Gospels tell. Then he mentions this other Mary. He doesn't explicitly state her, which could be an indication, once again, that he is following the technique and the writing of Mark, who explicitly says that Mary is the mother of James. And so you have Mary, the mother of James, Mary Magdalene, explicitly mentioned by Matthew, but no one else. It just says they came to the tomb. Mark not only mentions Mary and Mary, but mentions Salome, and then mentions that they're coming and bringing spices with them. Now, Luke broadens the group a little bit, and this is where some people come in and say, oh, there's expansion here. But the interesting thing is he doesn't mention anybody specific like Salome that Mark does. So Luke, he doesn't do his till later. He does his down in verse number 10. If you look on the screen, it was Mary Magdalene, if you see it in pink highlighted, Joanna, who is mentioned earlier in chapter 8. So this is a good indicator to us. Joanna was a wife of a very important figure who worked through the government. And so she was probably very wealthy, one of Jesus's followers who's probably funding some of his ministry. So she's there, but Matthew and Mark don't mention her. Now, John, on the other hand, he doesn't even mention anybody but Mary Magdalene, which I'm going to show you, I think, is specifically a second trip or a second scene of a first trip at minimum. But notice what Luke does. You got Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women that were with them. Now, notice that that is in the plural in verse 10 of Luke's gospel, other women. So he lists three, and there's at least two more. We know one of them from Mark's gospel is Salome. Why does the name Salome not get mentioned by Luke? Why does he silence her? He knows Mark exists. He knows that you could put it there. He went along with the other Mary and explicitly said the mother of James. And then he even mentions Joanna. Why the uniqueness of putting Joanna first? Now, note what happens here in Mark's gospel as well. You have a woman that's not in the other gospels, Salome, and Luke has a woman that's not in the other gospels. We find Joanna. So this kind of hints to us who maybe the eyewitnesses were that were reporting this to the evangelists who are actually scribing this. It seems like Mark is attached to Salome. Now, why that is the case, we're left to speculate. But Salome is an important figure for Mark and for Mark only, because we find her back in chapter 15, verse 40 as well, where it says some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, Mary, the mother of James, the younger or the less, and of Joseph, and Salome. There's Salome again. So Salome is an important figure for the crucifixion. Salome is an important person for the resurrection to the Gospel of Mark, not mentioned by any of the other gospel writers. And so much so that Matthew doesn't even mention the other Mary explicitly, but generally. So it seems like Matthew's gospel is primarily going to be based on A, Mary Magdalene's telling of the story, B, perhaps just following the original script that was reported by Peter in the Gospel of Mark, but didn't see it necessary to mention Salome at all. Luke doesn't mention Salome, but brings another woman in the perspective and tells the story slightly different as well. Now, this seems like chaos, but it's really not, because if they're trying to get their story straight so that everybody can have the same story when we get asked about it, then what in the world are they doing here? Like, you're introducing new women, new characters, and then you're leaving other characters out, and you're not explicitly naming the Mary, given that Mary is a very, very common name in the gospel accounts, not even clarifying in Matthew's gospel which one. What's going on here? Well, I think what this demonstrates is each gospel writer is independently telling the story from what information they have. And it seems like Matthew's gospel is primarily based on Mary Magdalene, trip 1. Mark's gospel is primarily based on Salome's perspective, maybe with the addition of Mary Magdalene, corroborated with Mark and Matthew together. So Mark could be doing that from Peter's perspective of telling the sermon from what he remembers of Mary Magdalene. After all, she went and told him and John about it. So he naturally had correspondence over what took place. Luke seems to be going away from their narrative telling perspectives and focusing on a different position and almost a slightly different timing. And I want to get into that a little bit because he could probably get his information maybe not from Mary Magdalene and maybe not from Mary, the mother of James, but from the figure he mentions, particularly only in his gospel back in chapter 8 and as well here in chapter number 24, and that is Joanna. So it may be from her perspective. John, on the other hand, does mention that Mary Magdalene had come to the tomb and then talks about a correspondence and a running away and talking to the disciples and then telling them he's not here, he's gone, and then they take off and they enter the tomb. So John had correspondence with Mary Magdalene directly when the news first broke, him and Peter together. So naturally, we'd expect to see him focus on Mary Magdalene as well. So far, we see the women on the scene, and so they kind of give us a different idea. Now, Luke's gospel in chapter 23 tells us that the night before, the women had already made a plan, that when the next day, the morning came, they were going to go meet at the tomb, and they had collected spices to anoint Jesus in. So we can pretty well assume that they went to their respected homes, and the meeting place was, of course, the tomb, and that the time of day that they agreed to meet was probably at sunrise, when the day of the week began at dawn. And so that seems to be the time and meeting place for the women to come from different places and different homes to meet up to do this. And what seems like happens at the beginning of these gospels is that there's slightly different timings as to when the story is being told. For example, over here in Matthew's gospel, it says that as the day dawned, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb, and there was a great earthquake where an angel of the Lord, singular, came and descended down. Now, this is interesting because none of the other gospels mention an earthquake. So was it an actual earthquake in the sense of like everybody in the city felt this thing? I don't think so. I actually don't think that's what happened. I think that the shaking of the ground that was in the form of an earthquake was the angel coming down from heaven and hitting the ground and moving this giant stone. So they were able to witness and feel the effects of what it was like for the angel to move the stone. Now, the angel didn't move the stone so Jesus could get out. It seems like he's already gone. He moved the stone so they could see that Jesus was gone. So this angel descends from heaven, rolls back the stone, and sits on the stone. Now, Mark's gospel, this earthquake never happens. This rolling back phase never happens. In fact, Matthew even says the guard shook, fell down, and became like dead man, and the angel starts talking to the women. And it even talks about his countenance. It was like lightning, and his clothing was pure white as snow. Mark, not that specific. No earthquake, but it does say that they came early in the morning on the first day of the week. They came to the tomb when the sun had risen. So notice this. Did they come when the sun rose up, or did they come, as John says, while still dark? Or as Luke says, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb bringing spices that they had prepared. Which one is it? Was it right before the sun came up, as the sun came up? Well, again, let's just take this perspective from the women. Let's say Mary Magdalene got there first. That seems to be the case in all four gospels, that she got there first. John gives us a specific timing of when she got there, while it was still dark. It could be that the scene picks up in Matthew's gospel from her perspective. So what John's telling us is what happens when Mary Magdalene gets to the tomb, while it was still dark and the stone had been rolled away. Matthew wants to tell the how. John's not interested in repeating the synoptics. He knows they exist. He's interested in telling you what it means, not how it happened. Matthew wants to give you the details. So it could be that Mary Magdalene provided that her, and notice, it doesn't mention any of the other women. It's just Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the tomb. Well, what happened to Salome? What happened to Joanna? Well, here's probably what took place. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary got there at the same time while it was still dark, and they felt the ground shaking, and then they see this stone rolling away. And this angel sits on it. Scene 1. Scene 2. Salome now comes up to the scene. She's walking up with Mary and the other Mary. This is Mark's gospel. And on the first day of the week, just like the rest of them, they came to the tomb and when the sun had risen. So from her perspective, her telling of the story is, I remember the sun in the background had just gone up, and I look over the tomb and it's empty. Stones moved. See, if it's being told from Salome's perspective there, she's not going to tell you what Mary Magdalene just said moments before coming up to the tomb. She's coming up the tomb and telling it from her perspective. And in her perspective, she remembers a glimmer of sunlight when she remembers and recollects the event. It's a slight difference, but it indicates eyewitness perspective that's distinct at the same time. Note Luke's perspective here. It says, and they and certain other women with them came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared. And when they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, then they went in and did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. They didn't see the body. They were perplexed. Now note, 2 men stood by them in the shining garments. Now at this point, I don't think anybody's arguing about what these characters are wearing. Pure white, light lightning, shining. This is the descriptions. But notice the different words. One woman describes it as like lightning. Another woman just describes it simply as just white. And then on the other hand here, we find ourselves with a description of just pure white, clean as you could find situation of this being. But Luke mentions 2. Matthew and Mark mention 1. Now, is that problematic? And not only that, may I add, you're going to come into play and find all of what's happening in this scene transform based on different women's viewpoints. Different women are now coming in and saying what they saw in their minds in the timing they entered the tomb. When Mary Magdalene and the other Mary show up, the angel is sitting on the stone. He had just moved it. He decides to sit on top of it. By the time Salome comes in, we see the position change. Here it is. Look at Mark 16. When they get there, who will remove this stone for us, they say, and then they get there, and they looked and saw the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And they entered the tomb and saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting at the right side. So now he's sitting on the right side, not on it. Now he's jumped down. Okay. So this being was sitting on the stone after he moved it, apparently hopped down by the time Salome gets there. Now we're taking the camera outside of the tomb. Now we're going into the tomb. That's what Luke's focusing on. Luke's now focusing on, they look at the tomb, it's empty, and now there's 2 beings, 2 shiny white clothed beings standing with them. Notice their perspective. 2 men stood by them in shining garments. And as they were afraid and bowed their faces to the earth, they said, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Remember when he spoke to you, when he was still in Galilee, saying the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and the 3rd day rise again. And they remembered his words. And they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now, notice what happens. Now the women are not looking at a distance at these men. Now there's two men that show up. Now, I think what's happening here is this is Joanna's viewpoint. This is Joanna comes onto the scene. So she didn't see the angel sitting on the rock. That was Mary Magdalene. She didn't see the angel standing on the right side of it. That was Salome. Now she apparently shows up on the scene, doesn't give us all the preliminary stuff we just saw from the other two gospels. And when she gets there, now there's two shining ones that show up, and both of them are talking about the resurrection and how Jesus said, while he was in Galilee, he would be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be killed and then rise again on the third day. And it's like light bulbs go on. But if they did not all arrive at the tomb at the same time, it's understandable that if each person is telling a perspective, if we have Mary Magdalene, we have Salome, and we have Joanna's viewpoints, that if they got there at slightly different moments, now all of a sudden we start seeing the combination and the coming together of all of these stories at different moments and perspectives. There seems to be differences because it's being told from different perspectives. See, they're not just copy and pasting and copy and pasting. They have unique, independent viewpoints within the narrative of storytelling. So that's another difference here. Now, when we get to John, and I'm going to come back to John, it just mentions that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple, whom Jesus loved, which is John, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Oh boy. Now we're really messed up, okay? Because now John comes in and makes it sound like Luke is way off. Because they went back and told the men, this whole report. They remembered the words. They returned to the tomb and told all these things to the 11. And then he lists their names. So how do we reconcile this? How do we deal with this difference that just came into play? We look at Mark's gospel, the women go away scared, fearful, not knowing what to say. Because the instructions were, go tell my disciples and Peter that he's going before you in Galilee, and you'll see him just as he said. So they ran from the tomb, trembled, and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Well, Luke says they told everybody. John says they told Peter and John. Matthew, on the other hand, says they ran out quickly to the tomb in fear and great joy and ran to bring his disciples word. What in the world? And then it says, and as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them saying, rejoice. So they came, held him by the feet and worshiped him. Whoa, now we got the nuance here. So I color coordinated these. Let's focus at these one at a time. We must have different scenes. And I think that's exactly what happened. The first time that they come to the tomb, we find that they're being told not to say anything. Or that they said that they didn't say anything. They were told to tell them, but they said, we're not telling anybody. We're not going to talk to anybody about this. The other gospels, they told everybody. But Matthew kind of gives us an intermediate between what seems to happen. So Jesus bodily appears to some of these women while they're on their way to tell the disciples. Now, what could have happened is that they had no plan to tell anybody because they didn't know what to think. But because Jesus physically met them, they now had to tell the disciples he's risen. There's also the alternative that these women received the report from the angels, went and told the disciples what happened. The disciples, like John and Peter, had to go see it for themselves. That's very possible as well. And so whatever happens, it seems like multiple trips take place here. We know that happens at least twice because according to John's gospel, she went and told the women, and then she ran into Jesus. The other women go to tell the disciples, and they run into Jesus. So they keep having these encounters and a back and forth. Then you can argue there's a third trip when Peter and John get there. So there's multiple trips. And what's difficult about reading these side by side is we're like, what trip are we on here? Is this trip 1, trip 2, trip 3? Whose perspective? Is it somebody that came first? Is it somebody who came slightly second? Is it somebody who came slightly third? Which women are telling the perspective from their story? Luke's gospel reportedly shows Joanna probably to be the primary source. And from her perspective, she wanted Luke to know when they got there, they saw an empty tomb. These two men said, you need to go tell them what happened. Don't you remember Jesus said this? They said, yep, I remember it now. They remembered his words. They returned to the tomb. They told everything that they had heard to the 11 and then other eyewitnesses that were there. That's Joanna's perspective. Then we're over on the other side looking at not Joanna, but Salome. Salome's perspective is they came to the tomb, they heard the report and said, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Who was crucified. He's risen. He's going to meet you in Galilee. Look, no body. It's not here. Go tell his disciples and Peter. And then they were afraid. They fled from the tomb. They trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, what has been imposed on Mark is that he made some sort of like, they never said anything at any point to anyone ever again. That's not what it says. It says they didn't say anything to anyone. And we don't really know who that anyone is. Because the angel explicitly said, go tell these individual people what Jesus has a message for them. It could be that they weren't telling other people like family members, neighbors, and friends that their objective was to keep this information quiet, head back to wherever the 11 are, not tell anybody else what was just said to them until they met with Peter and the others first. That's probably the way that went. Now, according to Matthew, as they were going to tell the disciples, Jesus met these women, said, rejoice. So they came, held him by the feet, and worshiped him. Now, it doesn't explicitly say which ones, but there's apparently a Jesus appearance. Now, I think that appearance is post John's. So let's back up a little bit. Let's pick up on the scene. Here we are. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, get there first. They feel the ground move from the stone rolled away. Feels like an earthquake. Angel sitting on the tomb, sitting on the stone next to the tomb. Salome shows up. Angel hops down. He's on the right. They're now having a conversation with him. Luke's gospel now comes on the scene. Joanna now shows up. Joanna's there, and she sees two people. She remembers two shiny people standing in front of them. So these angels have now showed up in more than one form. And now they've slid over, coming closer to them. And now they're standing in front of them. And they're telling them, he's risen. He told you this would happen. They believed it. They run back to the disciples. Luke leaves it at there. And they go and tell, and then he reports. Peter takes off, and he runs to the tomb. And they only mention Peter doing this. Now, John now wants you to know he ain't the only one that went. It says Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. Now it says in verse 2, and nobody else reports this. She ran and came to the place where Simon Peter was, and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Report 1. Again, what was the message? In one sense, it seems like he is risen. Not if they went back and made multiple statements. Now, at this point, maybe the women doubted. That's a possibility, what was said. Didn't feel that way when you read Luke, but it's possible if you're reading Mark. It's very, very possible. They have taken his body. Some have suggested, and I don't really adhere to this one, that the women said something radical just to get a reaction for them to go check it out for themselves, almost like surprise. I don't think that was the case. Now, again, these women don't know that the messengers that told them these things are angels. They didn't say, I am Gabriel. We don't have that. Or I am Michael. Or I am Raphael. Like we don't have the names of the angels that are listed here. We assume they're angels based on their appearances. Based on Matthew's clause that they came from heaven, we can assume they're celestial beings. But we don't know. We don't know. As it relates to them coming in and talking to Peter and John, the report that Mary Magdalene gives is this. They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. There's a thought of robbery, grave robbery. It feels like John jumps into like scene 1, summarizes it. First day of the week before the sun came up, here's Magdalene. She sees the tomb is empty, runs to Peter, runs to John, tells him what happens. And it appears that Mary Magdalene maybe has taken more trips than any of the other women. How often did she go back? Because what happens is she becomes isolated and she's alone, and Jesus appears to her by herself in John's gospel. And then he appears to these other women on their way to tell the disciples what happened. So we've made, I think, a faulty assumption that all the women went off and took off at the same time in a big group and just ran all the way down and they all just came in. I don't know what happened, nor do any of us as it relates to where everybody was. To assume that Peter and John and all the others were in the same exact location, it's kind of an assumption. Maybe Mary Magdalene knew where Peter was. Now, don't forget, Peter had denied the Lord and ran off. Do you think that she just took 50 paces to the left and 100 to the right and then walked right up to Peter and found him? This is chaotic. This is frantic. There's a lot of running around. It could have been that the women split up. Now, Luke kind of tells us that they were given this message and they returned from the tomb and told all the things to the 11 and to all the rest. Notice how it's kind of like cumulative here. They told the 11 and then a bunch of other people. And then it says Peter. Notice what it says about Peter in the Gospel of Luke. Arose and ran to the tomb. Because they didn't believe it. Seemed like a tale, an idle tale. So Peter arose, ran to the tomb, and stooping down, he saw the linen cloths lying by themselves. And then he departed, marveling to himself at what had happened. He's in shock. Dismayed at what was just happening. So I find this intriguing, to be honest. One of the things that ends up happening to Peter is he's found, and it doesn't say who found him until we get to John, and it was Mary Magdalene. And apparently Peter and John ended up together somehow when Mary tells the story. But it seems that she only talked to 2 of them, which means they may have been isolated from the others. And Luke's just kind of like, all the women went out and basically told everybody what happened. And then they all just started coming and trying to find out for themselves. And Luke reports Peter. John tells Peter and him. So the women probably split up. Maybe Salome went this way. Joanna went this way because she knew where people were. And Mary Magdalene knew where Peter was. They probably split up. And some of these narratives are giving kind of like the accumulative last results without all the intermediate that happened in between. And so one gospel is like, well, wait a minute. Were they excited to tell disciples, or were they quiet and not telling anybody? I mean, what's going on? If it's multiple perspectives and multiple women who are doing things over periods of time and at different places, we've got to lose this mindset that like everything happens succinct. They came together. They left together. They went to the group who was together. The group together came to the tomb and everybody was there together, and everybody together. No. They were spread out. I mean, they were spread out, and they had to go find these people. This didn't happen in 5 minutes. I mean, they couldn't hop in the car and drive down the road. I mean, they had to go find people. They didn't have GPS on each other where they could track each other's iPhones. I mean, they had to go figure out where everybody was. They were hiding. I'm sure they had decent traces of where they were, but like, I mean, it's not like they sat there and could just track their iPhone and say, okay, Peter's over here. Let's see, Thomas is 2 miles away over here. Let's go find Philip and Bartholomew. They're somewhere over there. Like, they couldn't do that. It took time and a lot of travel. And it seemed like the women told nobody else that they passed by until they found the disciples and relayed the message. Mary Magdalene's first intuition when she goes to the tomb is they stole the body. Somebody took the body. We don't know where it is. So let's pick up in John's gospel there. It says, Peter therefore went out and the other disciple, and they were going to the tomb. So when both ran together, the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. So they're running. Apparently, John's got a little less pounds on him, or he's a little bit better of a runner. And he wants you to know he's faster than Peter. And he gets there first, and he looks in the tomb, and it's empty. Now, there's no angelic delivery of messages to them. They stooped down. Peter came in. He went in. The disciple went and stared inside the tomb. The handkerchief that was laying there that was around his head is laying, and linen cloths are laying there, and they're folded up. The other disciple who came to the tomb first went in and saw and believed. Peter kind of left and doubted what had happened, for yet they did not know that the scripture had been fulfilled and all that had been said, that he must rise again. And the disciples went away again in their own homes. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping. And then we know the story here. 2 angels in white sitting, one on the head and one on the feet. So she looks in the tomb, she's crying, and guess what she sees? The same thing that was mentioned earlier. But they're on the head and the feet of where Jesus laid. And there's 2 of them as reported in Luke. So it seems like there were 2 angels all along, and it could be that the other 2 gospels are focusing on the one who they visually saw or who they visibly remember saying what happened. Maybe one of them did all the speaking, or they remember the one that did all the heavy lifting and moved that stone over. But it's unique. They come into play here. They're coming into the scenery. The women are there. They're at the tomb, and now it's just Mary isolated. Another trip has happened. A lot of time has gone by. We don't know. This could be 3-4 hours later, folks. We don't know the timing of when all of this happened. And so it seems like another trip takes place. Now, when Mary's around Jesus, he says, do not cling to me, in verse 17, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Whereas Matthew says they held him by his feet and worshiped him. So that also gives us a timeline. When the women were on their way to tell his disciples. Jesus met them saying, rejoice. So they came and held him at his feet. This must have been after the isolated event with Mary, which means the women did not travel together in everywhere they went. As I said, they split up. They got there at different points and times. They left and came back and forth, apparently at different times. And Jesus met them at individual roadblocks, individual lanes, individual routes, and eventually met with all the others in Galilee. So what's happening here? What do I think is taking place here in all these things? To me, it's not as complicated as people want it to be. It's not as complicated. What I think is taking place is that we have these women who were coming with different perspectives at slightly different points, who split up to tell the disciples, different disciples at different places. And in the process of doing that, people are coming back and forth and back and forth. And that there are potentially 3 trips to the tomb. And sometimes a gospel writer will pick up on trip 1 and then trip 3. And one, like Luke, will summarize kind of like the whole thing, just summarize all of it. It tells it from particularly Joanna's perspective, Mark from Salome's perspective, John from Mary Magdalene's perspective on a different trip route than the one she tells in Matthew's perspective. And that all the women in the end clung to his feet. And I think he fast forwarded. I think Matthew skipped most of the events at the tomb. That's what I think is happening here in this text. And so when we're looking at the resurrection, the Gospels, it's not contradictions, it's different perspectives. It's different implementations of sight and sound and feels and things like that were going on, and telling it from their perspective. The angels, how many? Where were they? Were they on the rock or on the side of the rock? Are they standing in front of them? Were there 2 of them? Was there one? I mean, were they in the tomb? Were they out of the tomb? Were they at? That means that we're looking at a different scene. When they're moved, it's because the scene has shifted. If we're trying to read them all in one giant scene, we're going to hurt ourselves. I don't think that is the way to handle this. What is very clear from each of these witnesses is that Jesus is risen. They had a report that he is risen. And we find later in the Gospels, he starts appearing to his disciples in isolated forms, like we see here, or in Luke's Gospel, the 2 disciples on the road of Emmaus, or as Paul tells us, he appears to Cephas, and then he appears to James the just. So we find this happening where Jesus starts appearing to individuals or the whole group or additional people in the group, and certain people weren't there in the group later on. We see this. Thomas was apparently not there when the first report came. As I stated, they were spread out all over the place. They weren't all sitting together singing Kumbaya. Thomas was not there when Jesus appeared the first time, appeared the second time, where Thomas notoriously said, until I touch the prints of the nails in his hands, I will not believe. And then Jesus appeared once. He is there with the rest. And that's exactly what happens. So again, beautiful scenery here on all parts. The Gospels have given us a clear indication of what has taken place. And as a result of it taking place, by the end of the story, we find a very significant amount of people coming into play, telling the story from their perspective, their eyewitness, their experiences. And now the other disciples are on the scene. John's telling it from his visual, from what he remembers at the tomb, being there with Peter, what he saw, specific items, linens folded the way that they were at the certain places. Mary's back on the scene, telling her perspective, crying her eyes out. Jesus gives her a one-on-one appearance. It's now spread out. And then Luke's telling the 2 disciples, one of which is Cleopas' story in the next section. So it's beautiful as we see this thing unravel, that they're not just copying and pasting each other, and that there are distinctions and unique perspectives and things like that. And we should be thankful for that, because that shows that they're not just copying each other, and that they're not just faking this whole thing, that they're actually giving inside intel view from different perspectives. And I think the women at the tomb and how they're using the gospel, like Luke using Salome in the earlier portion and later, Mark using Salome earlier and later, and then Joanna and Luke's earlier and later, is really helping see everything that's going on from each writer's perspective, and probably who their eyewitness is giving them the report when nobody was there to share. All right, folks. Well, that's that. And I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something from this episode. Hopefully, it gave you a better perspective and insight as to perhaps what's going on at the tomb. Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. God bless.